Welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm Kathleen Walter. Joining us to discuss the headlines making news out of Washington is Newsmax contributor and political analyst Dick Morris. Dick, it's good to see you again.
Well, it's good to be here, Kathleen.
Plenty to talk about today. Let's start first with the confirmation hearings of Solicitor General and Supreme Court nominee Elena Kagan. Dick, if you were sitting on the judiciary, what kinds of questions would you have for the nominee?
Well, traditionally, we look at candidacies like this in a left-right perspective, and obviously she would be a leftist judge. She'd be more like Breyer and Ginsburg and Sotomayor and less like Roberts and Scalia and Thomas. But there's one particular area that really worries me about her, which is her views on free speech. She advocates apparently all kinds of draconian campaign finance limitations, all kinds of restrictions on free political speech, and advocates, as I understand it, increased abilities to sue for libel and defamation. And I'm very concerned about that. That's not a left-right issue. In fact, probably it's one of those politically androgynous issues.
Right.
But that's what I would focus on in my questioning of her.
Dick, with 12 Democrats and 7 Republicans on the Judiciary Committee, does anybody believe that this is going to be a difficult confirmation for Elena Kagan?
Well, 7 Republicans are enough to ask tough questions. And the way these confirmation hearings work is the nomination is a certainty until it isn't. And that relates largely to how she handles the interrogations. Now, of course, she has an advantage, which is that she's never sat on the bench, and therefore there are not a lot of opinions to ask her about. But I think that we'll see how she does in the confirmation. You know, these confirmations are always a given until somebody stumbles, and then all of a sudden they become a real fight.
Now, what are the chances that Republicans will filibuster? Senator Sessions says that he would not rule it out.
Well, I think that their focus is a very good one. They're not saying they're going to filibuster it just like they would, you know, any liberal nomination. I think they understand this is the Supreme Court and that he's filling he would be filling a liberal seat. She would be filling a liberal seat. But I think that their specific focus is that they want the memos that she wrote during her time in the Clinton administration to be released by the archives and by the Clinton Library and made available to the Republicans in time to be able to read them and study them and ask her questions. And they are threatening a filibuster if that doesn't happen. And I think particularly for a nominee that does not have judicial experience, so there's not a body of opinions from the bench for us to read, it would be very important for us to have access to those memos.
Now let's talk about another Supreme Court-related issue. In the 5-4 vote Monday, the Supreme Court upheld the Second Amendment. Does that scare you that an amendment to the Constitution was upheld by a single vote majority? And what is the impact if President Obama makes another appointment?
Well, it wasn't a question of upholding the Second Amendment. It was a question of interpreting it. The Second Amendment says a well-organized militia being essential to national security or something, comma, Congress shall make no law infringing the right to bear arms, or words to that effect. Now, the courts have historically held that the two clauses were interdependent and that the right to bear arms only related to state militias, not to a private citizen's right. Last year, for the first time, or 2 years ago for the first time, the Supreme Court agreed with the arguments of the people who oppose gun control and said that, no, these clauses are separate. You need a militia, and there's an individual right to bear arms, and this decision affirms that. And it's a 5-4 decision. Now, I'd rather it be more, but I'll take 5-4. And you know, Kathleen, all of the conservative judges have agreed not to die until a Republican takes office, so we don't have anything to worry about.
All right. Well, another big story in Washington today was the passing of Senator Robert Byrd, Democrat from West Virginia, and the longest-serving member in congressional history. What kind of legacy does he leave in the Senate? I
think a bitter one. I think that he's a former Ku Klux Klan member. I think his service in the Senate was nothing but destructive, and while I mourn the passing of any human being, I sure don't mourn his getting out of the Senate. It should have happened 20 years ago.
All right. Well, what does the senator's passing mean for the future of the finance reform bill that the Senate is voting on this week? It looks like Democrats won't be able to get 60 votes. Can we expect Republicans to remain united and block voting on the measure?
Yeah, but that's minor. They'll just call him back in and pass it once the West Virginia governor makes an appointment, and he's a Democrat, so he'll appoint a Democratic successor. You know, it's so funny and so interesting how Trent Lott's comments in support of Strom Thurmond caused such outrage that he was forced out of office. And yet the positive comments of Democratic leaders defending Byrd, who was a Ku Klux Klan member, elicit no such backlash.
There have been reports that the Obama administration is working on a so-called Plan B to grant amnesty to illegals by executive order in the event a comprehensive immigration reform bill doesn't win enough support to clear Congress. Dick, in your opinion, is it constitutional for President Obama to do that, and would he be breaking the law?
Well, I'm not a constitutional scholar. As I understand it, the power to pardon is a fairly extensive one, but it's always, of course, been used just for individuals. It's the only time it's ever been used for a class of people is when Jimmy Carter issued a blanket pardon to any draft resistors that they would not be prosecuted, and that was after the war was over and all of that. But to issue a blanket pardon, particularly for people who are not American citizens and not even here legally, really would clearly go against the whole spirit of the pardon provision. And let's bear in mind that what Obama has done is he's been in office for more than a year and a half, and in that period he had 60 votes in the Senate for the majority of that time, and yet he never brought immigration reform to the floor. And now, when it's clear that it would not pass, he's suddenly talking about bringing it to the floor, threatening to use his pardon authority, and all of this is grandstanding to get Latino votes for the election coming up in November. His ratings among Latinos have crashed because of the unemployment, because of the general feeling that he's doing a bad job, and because of his failure to push immigration reform. So now he's hurrying up at the last minute to try to demagogue the issue once again, and I hope he doesn't succeed.
Now, what recourse are you aware of do lawmakers have to undo a move like this? Bill O'Reilly is warning that Obama could face calls for impeachment.
Well, I think calls for impeachment would be fully appropriate in that situation. It would constitute an abuse of the pardon authority that would be historic in nature. But of course, bear in mind, with Democratic majorities in both houses, impeachment wouldn't go anyplace. On the other hand, I think the Republicans will win majorities in both houses, and I'm not sure that that might not be an issue to bring up next year, but let's wait for that fight until it comes.
All right, Dick, as always, we want to get your thoughts on some polls that caught our attention, and I'd like to start with the new Boston Globe poll that finds Senator Scott Brown, Republican from Massachusetts, more popular than President Obama. Does that surprise you at all?
Well, no, I think that Obama has been facing serious erosion in his base. He's already lost the Republicans and the independents, and now he's suffering huge losses among the Democrats over the oil spill and his incompetence there, and over his keeping troops in Afghanistan and not closing Guantanamo. So Brown, obviously, while his base is a Republican base, is making significantly more inroads among Democrats than Obama seems to be making among independents and Republicans.
Let's talk about Mike Huckabee. He is saying that polls show that he is the best person to take on President Obama in 2012. Number one, do you think Obama will indeed seek a second term? And two, do you believe that Huckabee is indeed the best person to take on Obama in 2012?
Well, I do think that Obama will run for a second term, obviously. And I think Mike Huckabee would be a wonderful candidate. I strongly like him. I've always supported him. I used to be his political consultant. I personally have entertained doubts, even based on conversations we've had, that he actually will run. And because of those doubts, I've endorsed Newt Gingrich, who also might not run, but might be more likely than Mike to run. And I certainly think either of them would be a very strong candidate.
What kind of presence do you think Sarah Palin would have in a presidential primary?
I think she'd open very strongly. She'd open as the front runner. But then I think she would fade, because I think voters would say, kind of a two-level reaction. I love Sarah Palin. I love what she's doing. I reject the criticism of her. I think she's competent and intelligent and able. But on the other hand, she's been unfairly vilified by the press, unfairly victimized, and sexist, horrible coverage. But the net result is that she has a lot of baggage that would make it very hard for her to defeat Barack Obama. And I think everybody's keeping their eye on that ball of winning the election in November of 2012, and I think they might vote for another candidate who they think might have a better shot against Obama, as much as they like Sarah Palin.
All right, Dick Morris, thanks so much. We appreciate your insight, and
Thank
it's
you.
always good to see you. And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.